I'm Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Angela.
We are the Ink Mages. Join us as we discuss all things fantasy, world building, storycraft, myths and legends, and of course, our own imaginative stories. Welcome to the Ink Mages podcast. We are so glad that you have joined us today because we have another author interview today. We have authors Andrew Zimba, who's going to be in the studio with us. He is a lifelong storyteller, an avid historian. He grew up reading stories of kings and kingdoms, as well as tales of myth and magic. He is the author of the historical fantasy In Times of War, A Tale of Ardalencor. Andrew is a native Minnesotan. He holds degrees from the University of Minnesota and also studied in Poland, which is really cool. Andrew and his wife currently reside in Texas. So we are going to bring Andrew onto the show and talk more about his book. Hey, Andrew.
Great to have you on the show. And it's fun to have a fellow Texan on the show also, actually, because, you know, it's always fun to have somebody who's from your neck of the woods. I saw some pics on Instagram of Andrew at a Renaissance fair. That's not too far from my house. I haven't been yet, but now I'm very inspired to give it a shot. I definitely feel like I need to go check it out.
It's a fun time. I think maybe depending on when they take the count, it's the largest in the U.S. or at least one of the largest. The one just outside of Houston, Texas Renaissance Fest. So.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Okay, well, I'm definitely inspired to check it out. And isn't it like open all year round? It's just...
Oh, no, it's just Saturdays and Sundays in October and November.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oktoberfest time. That's when you want to go.
Yes.
Okay. So I need to visit Texas.
Yes.
That window next week.
Yes, you do.
It's when it's relatively cooler. Like some Renaissance fairs are open in the summer, depending on where you are in the country. But October, November is balmy weather, I guess, to dress up. Though temperatures can vary depending on what's going on that year.
Well, I've learned to love to look forward to autumn and the weather cooling off now that I live in Texas. So, so here at the Ink Mages, we love our fantasy, sci-fi, nerdy facts. So we'd love to hear from you, Andrew. What is a fun, nerdy fact about you?
I've been a lifelong world builder from just as a kid, looking at books or atlases and kind of imagining what would be a story that could take place here, or what if there was a new country in this location. And then it kind of evolved into playing board games with friends. And what if we added, one or two new rules, or changed this, or took this from one game, put it into this game? That was something that always stayed with me. And I think the latest flavor of that is playing Dungeons and Dragons. It wasn't something that I did when I was growing up, but over the last 10 years or so, a friend of mine introduced me to the game. So as somebody who writes medieval fantasy, and whatever story you're writing, you're doing it by yourself. It's generally a solitary process most of the time. So playing D&D is collaborative storytelling, the surprises of, multiple people telling the story, interacting. I like that as a different approach to world building and storytelling. So geeking out, my nerd hobby is Dungeons and Dragons.
I think you're in good company, because I know a lot of people have rediscovered D&D as adults. I haven't dabbled with it, but I know a lot of my friends who never played it as kids have all of a sudden they do campaigns every month. And I think it's a great outlet to be creative and to just really get nerdy in that whole lore of mythology and medieval fantasy.
For sure. Yeah.
Well, and one thing I love about it is the creators made the game intentionally for the outlet of creativity and storytelling. And it's really fun when you know the history of the development of the game and how people use it. And there's so many authors and writers out there who have fan sites with stories that they've written together that they're actually publishing because of the D&D games. It's kind of an impressive game, and what it can do as far as what it releases creatively. And that whole collaborative style of storytelling is fantastic.
Part of my story has its roots in D&D, like the two main characters. It's an ensemble cast. There's multiple points of view, but the first two characters that you meet were characters in a D&D setting, in the sense that they were more game mechanics. They weren't really from Ardalencor. They weren't from anywhere. But I thought if I was going to write a story and take these two characters. I wanted to write historical fiction for a long time, a story that had already been told. And I was just putting characters into, I love history, but it's like, I already know what happens in this story. So one of the prompts for writing medieval fantasy was getting into D&D. I thought, what if these two characters that I've created, and they weren't really from anywhere, they didn't necessarily have a backstory, they were just more for playing the game. Well, how would these two characters meet? And going through that progression, and then developing them once I kind of had this inciting incident associated with them. So how would they meet? They probably don't know each other already, but they would meet in an army.
Wow.
And what happened with that army? Part of the army switched sides and joined the invading army. So you have invasion, you have rebellion going on at the same time. And then this was the backdrop of the story. Like, I didn't know what Ardalencor was. I didn't have a setting other than these two characters and some other survivors have fled to a forest. And then that's how D&D was part of the prompt. My love of history was the other piece. And I found also with medieval fantasy is D&D is a great laboratory. The game can be as complex or as simple as you'd like it to be, or as complex. And there's a lot of rules, but you can dial that up or dial it down as you're playing with different groups. But also you get a sense of how these fantastical elements collide or complement one another, right? With magical weapons or powerful creatures, magic, just whatever it may be. It's a great way to kind of prep and kind of a laboratory for different ideas and think, well, how do these two characters actually come to grips, right? You can kind of see that mirrored, and it's just a lot of fun playing with friends, and a great escape overall. So recommend D&D if you haven't played it.
Yeah, I get a lot of people recommending that I should dabble with that. So
I think you'd enjoy it. You'd enjoy it.
I hear it's fun. So you shared that how kind of that doing D&D helped start writing your story. Did you do any writing beforehand? Like, what's your writing journey before you started doing the D&D?
Yeah, in college, I was studying abroad in Poland, and just from learning the history, kind of getting immersed in the land, I wanted to write something that was set in like the early 1600s in Poland and Eastern Europe. And I thought it was this really awesome and less well-known history, at least when it comes to people in America or maybe outside of Eastern Europe. I wanted to tell that story, and part of it was research, source materials. I wanted it to be historically accurate. So finding references to certain things in this particular year versus I can find a reference that's 20 years later. Well, is that 20-year-old reference still correct back to, the early 1600s, or is that something new? So that was part of it. Part of it was also, I think, is writing, how do I put in new characters in this awesome history? And I think I learned along the way, I'm kind of shoehorning in characters who have to be in point A, then they have to be in point B, then C. But what's happening in the meantime, right? I think a lot of people who write historical fiction and do it very well, but I think oftentimes their main character spins off and becomes a spy, or goes on a secret mission, or does other things where we kind of wait for the history to catch up. And I didn't want to do that, but I also couldn't think of anything better to do with it. So it's kind of fits and starts with writing. I wasn't writing like all the time. I was doing other things, and life was happening, but I would kind of come back to this topic and say, you got to get serious about the research. Let's figure this out. So that was progressing. And then I started playing D&D at the same time. And then also Game of Thrones, the television show, was coming out. And I really liked the multi-vantage point. You can jump from where the action is, right? If there's a little bit of a lull here, go to this other character, go to this other story arc, and you pick it right up. And then you've got this ebb and flow that you control as a writer in terms of who the reader is with. But if it's just kind of history, sometimes it's hurry up and wait, and there's just these lulls until you get to the next dramatic beat. So I liked that from, hey, you've got two character ideas. You've always wanted to write a story. You love history on this broad immersive tale. Why don't you tell your own? And then seeing Game of Thrones was like, yeah, I can do this. Like, all the things have kind of been lingering and bubbling, for a while. Put that to use and write, and using a a blank piece of paper, telling a new story was really what prompted me and got me into it. And I didn't know how it was going to end, right? Part of it was discovery of who are these characters? What is this place? How do these things fit together? Part of it was writing at times. And then sometimes I'd have to stop and say, I don't know enough about, there's too many placeholders. Like they have to get to this place, and how far away is it, and how does this person connect to this person? So I'd have to stop writing and just do serious world building, figure out a map, figure out how these things come together. So that's kind of the origin story of In Times of War, A Tale of Ardalencor.
So with it being kind of a historical fantasy, did you feel kind of hedged into really sticking to true history? Or were you able to really world build and kind of create, since it's like fantasy inspired by history, were you able to kind of build your own? I know with mine, the historical time frame that I picked, there wasn't a whole lot of written history about the people group. There's a lot of legends, and I could kind of, I had to do a lot of research, which was fun for me. It was like digging for gold to do all the research.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
What was that like for you?
I wanted to tell. So Ardalencor is a made up place. I'm definitely inspired by history, but I wanted, like, this is a blank page. Let's figure out how things are going to work here. There's certain homages. When I was growing up, one of the first books I read on medieval history was about the Norman conquest of England. So some of the Ardalen soldiers wear what's very close to what a Norman soldier would wear at that time. So there's little flourishes, little homages, but I wanted to get away from I'm following or kind of mimicking a particular period in history. Right. There's medieval, certainly it's medieval fantasy. There's little Renaissance influences or other periods, but I didn't want it to run like this is a parallel universe of something else that was happening in history.
Okay.
But I think having that historical knowledge, it was kind of like there's this historical analog running in the background, like a scaffolding for the world. So like if it's a medieval society, you're going to need these elements. So whether you use them directly or there's some alternative option, the different the hierarchy within society or how do things fit together. Like there's templates that are kind of running in the back of my mind as I'm thinking about this, but I wanted it to be something where it was inspired by history, but also new and kept me interested. As I'm not quite sure how this is going to end. Let's see this as a creative process as well.
So you sound kind of like you write from the seat of your pants, like you're a pantser when you write, like you're letting the story develop. You don't necessarily know where you're going until you arrive.
I think with the first book, certainly I had an idea of how the book should end, but basically the characters told me, no, we would not pick this place where the climatic scene would take place. We're trying to be in a different location. You're trying to bring us back to this other place that you might think is cool. You might think is a good ending, but the story should actually end here. So part of it was I liked that uncertainty of how is this story actually going to unfold. It can be nerve-wracking a little bit at times. Like, are you actually going to get this done and pull everything together?
Yes.
But once the first book was done, going into the second, because there's some storylines that resolve in the first one.
Yeah.
Others that are more kind of obvious will take place in book two, and then some longer things that you really have to be paying attention to what might be going on with some characters to get a sense of it. But in I guess a shorter answer to your question is book one was more wide open. Once that got locked in, with book two, I have been trying to be more deliberate with planning. And like, if this character only shows up in 4 chapters, what is going to happen to them that's significant, that one furthers this broader story where all these arcs either converge or come together, but also what's happening with that character, that it's interesting for the reader, where you've seen progression for this character and how to map that out. So much more planning, but then kind of what's happening in that chapter is a little bit more freeform. I may just have a few notes like these things have to happen. You have to mention this. Yeah. But then how things go a little bit more flexible. How does it relate to the two of you? How do you go about it?
I'm a pantser, so kind of a lot like what you said. It's more of letting the characters talk to me and tell me where they kind of want the story to go. And I'm just, all right, we go with that idea. And sometimes I have to scratch an entire thought because someone makes a decision that I didn't plan for.
Yeah.
I'm definitely a plotter. So I have it almost entirely. Well, you know, I was a plotter, let's say, with the first 3 books. My first 3 books, I knew from beginning to end how it was going to happen, where we were going, where the tip of the arrow was pointed. However, I think that's the beauty of being a writer is your characters do kind of take over and start telling you actually how the story's going to go.
Yeah.
So there's always that freedom, even with my plotted ideas where, oh, actually, we're going to do this and we're going to have to change this around. And so I think that's the fantastic part of writing is that whole world that comes to life around you as you're writing it, for sure.
So on the subject of characters, since we've been talking about them, can you kind of break down your main characters? From the blurb, I think there's like an orc and maybe half human. So kind of go through who are your POV characters and give us a little like inside scoop about them.
Yeah. So the first 2 characters you meet are Bambenek the scout and Dronor the half-orc mercenary. And
half-orc. Half-orc, there we go.
Yes, the half-orc, yes. So, you know, and that was also another piece of, well, what are orcs and what's their origin story and how do they fit in this world? So there was a whole other piece about how to explain Dronor, but also in the context of the world as well. So that's a theme throughout the story as well. So they're your rank and file soldiers. I wanted to tell from multiple points of view. So they're more of your rank and file soldiers. They fled to this forest. Nobody is coming to save them. They've got to figure out where to go next. There's other people who join them as well. And you see kind of these clashes between commoners and nobles and I'm in charge. No, you're not in charge. I'm in charge. But they still have to rescue themselves. So how do they work together? So there's tension within that. You hear from the rebels, who are this noble faction, and things have gone very well for them, but not 100%. There's a few things that have not gone their way as part of this rebellion, and they've surprised the High Lord, and you meet him and his faction later as well. He's lost 80 or 90% of his army. He's had to flee. Some of his best soldiers have switched sides. He's facing invasion. Is he even secure on his throne? Right. So part of the decision is, do you want to stay in this fortress and make a stand? Do you want to flee back? He ends up taking a lot of his army back with him to the capital, which would seem counterintuitive, right? The enemy is before you. Why are you lessening the number of forces you have to fight? And he basically tells the garrison commander at this fort, he said, I've lost my army, or just about all of it. I can't go back to the capital with nobody. So he has to make a political decision and at least seemingly appear that I still have some support. This has happened, right? There's been a rebellion. We're invaded, but still back me, right? Because you can be in charge, but people have to agree to that too. So there's this other piece of trying to maintain his throne. Those are some of the major factions. There's a wizard's order. You meet a number of people within that. There's some other groups, and it kind of takes you across different places of Ardalencor about how these different societal groups, but also geographically, how they're confronting and dealing with what's going on.
So you've got wizards, we've got a half-orc warrior here. What are some of the other fantasy creatures you've got going on in this world? Love to hear about those. Also love to hear a little bit, what's your antagonist in your story?
So the other groups, there's some elves, dwarves.
Let's go.
High fantasy land.
Yes. So there's definitely homages. I think we're all indebted to Tolkien in many ways with what he's created. I do try to flip things a little bit. Like there's elves who are basically the sworn protectors or the bodyguards of the High Lord of Ardalencor. So they come in basically as this protective guard in Ardalencor. They all have kind of shaved heads, like buzz cuts, and they use crossbows. And this just kind of is a little bit of a flip from the long hair and the long bow, just as a small little change. And there's some other things that are different than maybe typical elven lore or the Tolkien way of doing things. But homage to that, dwarfs as well, halflings, There's a wizard apprentice who's trying to become a wizard, or part of the wizard's order, an apprentice trying to become a wizard, who's a halfling. Her name is Malu Littlecheek. That's my wife's favorite character.
I love that.
So I was describing her to my wife, like, hey, I've come up with this new character, and I think something terrible will happen to her in the chapter in which she's introduced. And my wife sprung out of the chair and said, you will not do that. So just in describing the characters, that's my wife's favorite character.
Yeah.
The antagonist in his faction, his name is Duke Potazar. And part of it was he's a very, very militaristic, and it's a very, very accomplished soldier. And I was thinking about, okay, what are his grievances? I didn't want this to be like classic bad guy versus good guy in terms of like, there's no shades of gray, but also like, what are his grievances? What of the people that he's representing, you know, what has transpired in this country that has kind of led to this? And there's this theme beneath it of what's happened to us as a people of this land. At some point, we have to try to come back together. But if it's too far down the road, are we all going to be worse from the situation? Obviously, the rebellion and the invasion is a terrible situation, but if it's resolved quickly enough, hopefully that can be repaired. Like there's been upheavals within any country, right?
Yes.
Over time, and you can repair and heal from that. But there's people saying, when is this going to be enough? Like, let's figure out how to solve this. Or does it get too far along that it's like, we can only solve this by beating you, you know? And it's like, we have to, there really is no resolution other than somebody wins and somebody loses, absolutely, with that. But there's others who say, even though you had these grievances, you went as far as rebellion, you went as far as working with this invading army.
Yeah.
You know, you've gone too far, whatever you think, whether you think Ardalencor is the right person to be leading this country or not, right? So there's all these kind of philosophical, societal subtexts in there, in addition to the different character journeys that are taking place.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got a lot of political intrigue, which is,
yes,
I love when a deep world building fantasy, high fantasy has those elements in it, because I love Tolkien, but I always felt like with the movies there wasn't any political intrigue because the enemy was, you know, Sauron and a bunch of orcs. But like when you actually have kingdoms and factions, then it's like, oh, we've got some court politics going on, and that stuff always fascinates me. Did you find that your love of history and studying like the medieval era is what inspired you to put in those types of political factions?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. Just, yeah, like you said, the rich, many tragic examples from history that you can draw from or be inspired by in terms of creating your own subtext to things. So yeah, most definitely.
What is some of the things that most attracted you to the medieval era, that inspired you to really want to dive into that world and just bring it to life in fantasy?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's a good answer to that other than it just kind of, it is. Like, I like Star Trek, I liked sci-fi, but I would always gravitate towards, you know, where are the books on the knights, right? Where's the medieval history? That was always kind of my first love. So I don't know if there's like a rationale for it. It's just something that I was always interested in a kid. I tend to like that historical period. Like I'll learn about modern stuff and ancient as well, but that was always kind of where I would gravitate towards. So I don't know, other than it's just kind of in me, I think is if that makes sense, if that's the best way to describe it. Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like that was a hard question. I was like, how would I answer that? But I feel I feel like as a kid, I like watched a cartoon of Robin Hood and Ivanhoe, and it was like, that's it. That's all I wanted after that. I was like, I want bows and arrows. I want knights, you know, doing duels, and nothing else was going to be interesting.
Yeah, there's something about that era. You know, my books are more set in the, you know, 5th, 6th century, so very like old Celtic. But even spending time in those countries, like my imagination was just so inspired by the idea of history entwined with magic, and that all of these myths and had a life that existed. And there was a reason why people believed and told the stories the way that they did. And then, yes, just the medieval, you can't almost separate your idea of medieval times from dragons and all of these other wondrous things and heroes and knights. And it really is a fantastic and inspired time frame. You know, you talk about it being the Dark Ages, but there was so much about it that pulled on legendary myth and things like that that just make it very magical. So
even the belief in magic,
yes,
at the time, and
yes,
the natural world and how things either were in conflict or in harmony. A lot of cases, like, here are the things you need to do to keep the balance within this. I was reading actually an account of a battle that took place in the 1600s. And there are letters from different noblemen to one another talking about how they caught a magic user in their camp who was trying to put a curse on the army or create this fog screen that would obscure the movements of the other army. So whatever people think about magic now, these are prominent people who are in command of an army or play a certain, a significant part in it, saying the other side was trying to cast a spell on us.
Yes.
To aid them, right? And this is not too far away. So I think there's these reverberations throughout history of magic. So I think even for our ancestors, it meant a lot, and I think we kind of carry on that tradition in a sense with the storytelling.
Without a doubt, I love that. So what's next for you?
Yes, working on book 2, maybe about halfway through the first draft of it, but picking up from book 1. Book 1 ends in a cliffhanger, and then book 2 picks up moments after the first one ends. So getting like this pacing of, here's all the points of view that are taking place like right after, and how far is the sun up and what time is it and that kind of thing, to put everything together. So trying to keep the momentum going from book 1, but about halfway through. And I envision this being maybe 4, maybe 5 books. But I love the discovery process of, I don't know how book 2 ends. I have a working idea. I wanted to do much more structuring now that I've launched a number of characters. There's different storylines and threads that have to line up or continue to intertwine. So there's more planning, but I like being surprised along the way. It's like, as long as I'm going in the right direction, that's good. But yeah, working on book 2, hope to make it a full series of books about Ardalencor.
Let's go.
Awesome. Yeah, surprises are fun. Sometimes they actually end up being the most memorable part
Yes.
of a book. So what advice would you give someone who wants to write a book? Maybe they've started or they're afraid to start. What advice would you give to someone who's just wanting to start writing a book?
I would say just keep going. I mean, I wanted to write a book for probably 20 years. I didn't work on it for 20 years. Like, I would work on this historical fiction for a time, set it aside. Other things would happen what would happen along the way, just life in general, come back to it later, set it aside, pick it up. So if people are thinking, well, I've had this idea for quite some time, I wanted to write a book for quite some time too. So keep at it. You may have to shift your story. I loved history, but had to pick a different topic, right? I had to go into fantasy and, imagine and create new things to really tell the story that, like, I think I was meant to tell. Like, I love these characters and working in this space. So I think just keep at it. You do have to sit down and write and just kind of decide in what order do these words go. So there's an element of time. And I think leaning into that, like, I think there's times when you don't want to write, but if you sit there for 10 or 15 minutes and you lean in, you will start to get something, even if it's like, how do I describe this piece of clothing, or what food are they eating, or just thinking about, what does this other character think about this situation that's going, you'll find something to pull at. But if I can add a little bit more, if you're writing medieval not necessarily medieval fantasy, but any fantasy, right? Fantasy, the hallmark is, what is the world that you're creating? And for me, one of the things that I learned with this was, there's setting your world up, and then there's setting your world in motion. And I think of it as, like, setting your world up is, what are all of the ingredients that you're going to use to bake or make something? in setting your world in motion is how much of each one of these things do I want to pick, and in what order do they go into the cooking process? Right? Because if you're taking all these fantastical elements like time travel and dragons and magic and all these things, like how does it actually work together then in the story that I want to tell?
Right.
And for me, that was trying to build a very immersive world. Readers have told me this place feels very real, which was something that I really appreciate that feedback. And it was something that I was going for. But as I talk with others about world building, setting your world up, like what are all the pieces that are in the world, setting your world in motion, how do these things all come together is one of the learnings for me. Like, okay, how do you do this? So there's this magic, but how does it work in practice? Those kind of things.
Right.
So,
that's an excellent tip. I was just like, whoa.
Yeah.
I want to keep this in my, yes, write that down.
So like for elves, like just as an example, if elves lived to be 1,000 years, let's say, like I didn't quite, I don't know if I could comprehend that and how it would work in a story. So I dialed it back to like 2 to 3 times an average human is how I describe it in the book. So like just kind of asking questions like, how does this world work in motion? If there's an elf who's 1,000 years old, and let's say there's a feast, do 30 generations of elves come to the family farm for this feast? And maybe not. Maybe you say, no, it wouldn't be that way. It would be different. It's just more kind of a question. I find questions, and there's no right or wrong answer to it. It's like, how would this work? If somebody's 1,000 years old, what would life be like?
Yeah.
Like just on a very basic level, whether that's in your story or not, but it kind of informs the world. Or if there's a shoemaker, like an elven shoemaker might be making shoes for 700 years. Right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, there you go.
And if it's a traveling shoemaker, all the other shoemakers in town are going to be like, he makes the best shoes. They last forever. He can beat us on he can beat us on speed, quality, price if he wants to. Like, we're not going to sell shoes for 30 years if this guy comes through. And this is just kind of a silly, kind of arbitrary thing, but it's like they would have all this knowledge. Presumably, they might not. And you say, well, no, they wouldn't. And here's why. And then you take it into different directions. So I like asking these questions, and I had to ask them of myself, like, how does this work? Especially with different factions in conflict. Like, why hasn't like faction A already beaten this other faction? Like historically, like why would they even try to rebel? Well, there's got to be these other things going on. So these kind of questions, maybe a bit silly. Maybe your book isn't about that, but it's like these thought experiments.
Yeah.
It takes you in different directions, and then you build your own world, and you get like, this is true here, but wouldn't be so much true. And a lot of it is just like building a puzzle, and you don't know what all the puzzle pieces look like. There's no cover of the box. There might not be edge pieces, and you just kind of figure it out as you go. But I think that's part of the love of discovery and storytelling. So I would say keep going and like ask questions, spend time in your world, even if it's not directly related to where you are in a particular chapter. But just think about like, how would this work? And then I think you get a better sense, and then you can spawn those ideas. Maybe that's a new character. Maybe that's a backstory. You know, maybe it's a source of conflict between two other characters. And for me, that was really helpful.
Yeah, I like that too, because one of the lessons I've learned in all the books that I really love, there's always this sense of more. And I think when you're willing to play those kind of games or develop things, even if it doesn't end up in your story, the reader feels like it does. Even if the words aren't written there, because it existed in your imagination, because you asked those questions, there is that mystery of more attached to your story that the readers pick up on. And I think it's a really good practice to do that, because your world should be bigger than everything that you have written down on the page. And I think that's what J.R.R. Tolkien did so brilliantly, because he wrote histories and answered questions and stuff that never made it into his book. But we all felt it. We all felt like there was a lot more to be known, which eventually caused us to, fans pulled on strings until we started getting these histories that were written and they were out there. And so I think it's super good advice because you don't always have to only have what's been written in your book be what exists in the world that you're building. And it gives it more life and feeling of more, which I think you want to have in a good epic.
Yeah,
So
I like
go
the way
ahead.
you said that, the mystery of more. I think that's
Yeah.
brilliant. Yeah, I like the way you said that.
Well, thank you. So, Andrew, tell us, where can we find out more information about you? Where can we go to buy your book?
So the book's available on Amazon, In Times of War, A Tale of Ardalencor. Also ardalencor.com. You can read the first 3 chapters of the book. Check it out there as well. I'm most active social media-wise on Instagram. I post about the book. I also post writing tips, world building tips. If you like longer form writing or world building tips, I also have a Substack,
Nice.
andrewzimba.substack.com, where I post periodically as well about different lessons from my own world building experience, try to provide just some very kind of punchy advice with a few examples with each one, just to try to streamline and help people who are getting into this too, because it can be very complex, or as complex as you want to make it. So just sharing lessons that I've learned along the way as well.
I love that. We will be sure to be putting those links in the description and making sure people know where to find you. And you guys, it's Christmas time. Buy a copy of Andrew Zimba's book. Support him as an author. It sounds like a fantastic book. I can't wait to read it. This is one of my favorite things about meeting all of these authors, is that I get to know about all these fantastic books that are out there for me to read.
Yes.
So please get on Amazon, buy a copy of his book, buy a copy of his book for somebody else. And please support the Ink Mages. Give us a like, give us a comment,
Yes.
share our podcast with all of your friends, and let us know what you think. And Andrew, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's been awesome. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been great conversation.
Yeah, it's been
All right.
fun. We've loved having you.
Yeah, it's been so fun. So we'll see you next time on the Ink Mages. Thanks for joining us.